where we left off on Monday was Elizabeth had been born, she had a wonderful childhood. She really did. And then her uncle abdicated the throne, and she became the heir to the throne through her father. And during the war, she and Margaret stayed in stayed in England throughout the whole war years. And in the meantime, she had fallen for Philip. And after the war, they got married. And that's where we ended. So Elizabeth is now married. And that's it. So, as I said the other day, I love that quote, "It's good to be queen," that she had needle pointed on one of her pillows. And now, today we're going to look at the reign. You know, what happened in the 70 years. Remember, at the beginning of this month, she started her 70th year as queen. Okay, the stress of World War II took a toll on George VI's health. And I have to say, I decided this morning, I thought I better run through the PowerPoint, make sure I have everything in order. And I decided to put a new slide in here that you'll see. Also, you'll be glad to know, I taught history, I didn't teach English. And I'm a terrible speller. And as I was going through the slides, I found 6 spelling errors. So if you happen to see one, let me know afterwards. I'll get it corrected.
Do you use the British O-U-R or just the American?
I did all American.
Oh, okay.
Okay. Everything's spelled American, not
Okay.
British. Okay, so the stress of World War II took a stress on George's health. Now, I put this slide in because I wanted you to see what happened. I'm just probably standing right in your way.
Right.
Where do you see the difference?
Oh my goodness.
Here he was when he became king in 1936. There's 1952. That's only 16 years.
Oh my.
You know, he looks, here he really, I think he's a very handsome
Oh yeah.
gentleman. Look at that, he looks just terrible. And it was the stress of the war. And a year after her wedding, they found that he had a blockage and he almost lost his right leg. They were really tempted to take his leg off. They didn't. But his health continued worse. Not only the stress of the war had been devastating on him, but he smoked constantly. And it caused him unbelievable problems. He was coughing terribly, he had terrible pains in his chest, and so they examined and they found that he had lung cancer. They did not want to tell the British public this, and so they put an operating room in Buckingham Palace. They operated, took the lung out, and I'm gonna experiment with something. Would you hold that a second? Would you hold that?
Okay.
Oh, okay. Wait. Oh, you probably can't see it. So, yeah, it's pretty dark. I'm going to move this over just
Okay, I can,
there,
there we go.
You got it.
so we can get the words a little better. So they took out his left lung, and in the operation they noticed it had moved over to his right lung too. The doctors never told him that he knew he had lung cancer, but they never told him that his right lung was infected, and he only had 1 year to live. They didn't want to discourage him. Elizabeth's private secretary, and he was with her forever, began carrying along what was called a draft accession declaration, where when she would become king, she would have it with her, because she was doing an awful lot of touring for her father at this time. He just simply could not tour. And so they were getting prepared for this. Due to her poor health, she and Philip increasingly went more and more overseas. That's how they really became well known, and how they really got used to being king or being queen, and he her helper in this. With the deteriorating his health, however, Philip resigned from the Navy. He had been in the Navy. He actually had a ship under him. All during World War II, he had been in the Navy. And then when he married Elizabeth, he had a commission and he had a ship. And he and Elizabeth actually went on the ship and lived in Malta for a long time. And he thought, of course, that George was going to live forever and ever, or for a longer time than this, and that he would simply be in the Navy. But now with this increased pressure of George being sick, he resigned from the Navy. January 31st, 1952. Elizabeth and Philip are going to go on a tour. They're actually going to go to see Australia and New Zealand. The king and the queen had been, they were planned to go, but of course he was just in such poor health. So they said they would go there, and they were going to stop off first in Kenya, which they did. Against his doctor's advice, George went to see her off at the airport. And you see him here? He looks just absolutely horrendous.
Oh, man. He's on his feet.
He looks just terrible. And look how good Elizabeth looks, Queen, his wife. Now, she was always just a vibrant individual. It was the final time that the people saw him in public.
Turn that off.
And there he is, he's waving to her. They arrive in Kenya, and they stay at Sagana Lodge. It had been a gift from the people of Kenya to her and Philip for their wedding. And so they were staying actually at their own house. And that's probably the most famous picture. It was published all around the world of them at Sagana Lodge. After sending them off from the airport, the king and queen returned to Sandringham, and they were in charge of Prince Charles and Princess Anne. And remember, they're really young at this time, and so they were going to babysit their grandchildren. That on February 5th, the king had an afternoon of shooting, and then he played with the two grandchildren, and he ended up right before dinner, he had dinner with Princess Margaret. And so, wait a minute, I'll let Sushi hear. And so he had supper with Princess Margaret. Then at 11 o'clock, as was always done, his valet brought him a cup of hot cocoa, and he went to bed. At 7:30 the next morning, the morning valet came and began to run the water for his bath. And the king was a heavy sleeper, and so he'd hear the water, and that's what would cause him to get awake. And yet he didn't come into the bathroom. And so for his bath, and the valet went into the bedroom, and he found the king had died in the night. He died in his sleep. And that instituted that wording, Hyde Park Corner. That was the key words that he had died. That set into motion all the planning, everything that needed to be done now that the king had died. The problem is that Elizabeth had spent the day up in this tree house watching the animals. Remember, she's still in Kenya, and she was watching from this giant tree house. They immediately, as soon as he died, they sent word to Kenya, but the governor of Kenya wasn't there. He was out. And so nobody officially knew that the king had died. And a reporter heard it over the news, asked Philip, who was not with his wife at this point, hadn't gone to see the animals, he said, is it true that the king has died? And Philip immediately, they telegraphed back to Buckingham Palace and got confirmation that Elizabeth was now the queen. And he broke it to her. She returns, and he now says, you are the queen. She almost immediately returns. Princess Elizabeth now becomes, and this is her full title, even until today, Elizabeth II, by the grace of God, of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland, and of her other realms and territories, Queen, Head of the Commonwealth, Defender of the Faith. Sort of a mouthful, isn't it? And we just say President. That's actually her whole title. Today, 53 countries recognize her as queen in the world. She now traveled back. They had brought mourning clothes along with her in case her father had died, and she was dressed in mourning clothes. Now, she's going to land at Heathrow Airport. Do you notice somebody missing from that picture? Yeah, Philip isn't there. Now, he's actually with her, but he's inside. Because she is now the queen, she got to walk down. She had to walk down by herself, and Philip had to stay so many paces behind her. So I think it's a really telling picture that, Philip was not in that picture. When she arrives, the Prime Minister, Winston Churchill, was there, Clement Attlee, Anthony Eden, they were in the opposition. Frederick James Marcus, who was the president of the council, that was her, would be her counselors, and the Duke of Gloucester, and the Mountbattens. Why are the Mountbattens there? Family. Right, they're Philip's family. And so they are there to greet her. She then traveled to Sandringham, that's where he had died, and her father was in the chapel. That's actually a picture of it. Some of these were not easy to find, I'll tell you. She said that her named her mother now the Queen Elizabeth, the Queen Mother. And I was born in 51, so all my life, Elizabeth has been queen. And I always knew her mother as the Queen Mother. That was just part of my upbringing. At the funeral, this is a picture of the three queens. Elizabeth is to your left. I did think it's to the left. And then so that had been his daughter. His mother, Queen Mary, was still alive. She's in the middle. And then Queen Elizabeth, is the Queen Mother now, is to the right. That's really a fabulous picture. The Duke of Windsor attended the funeral. Remember, Duke of Windsor was originally Edward VIII.
Yes.
He had abdicated, but he did come to the funeral, and he's right here in this. He met with Elizabeth afterwards. When he abdicated, he and his brother George had made an agreement that out of the personal funds of George, he would give his brother £10,000 a year, which is about $25,000. Now, the reason why he made that agreement is the royal family does not own, we're going to actually do this on Friday, does not own part, like Buckingham Palace belongs to the people, the government and the like, but they do own two different areas. Sandringham and Balmoral actually belong to the family. They bought those during Victoria's reign. And so it's family property. And so to pay off Edward, George said, okay, we'll give you $10,000 a year, or £10,000 a year, and that way you can live on that money, but you now no longer claim to that property. And that was the deal. Well, they had since then lowered that down, taken away, and he needed that money back because he was buying a house in France. And so he asked her for that money back. And he said, this is a direct quote, "It's hell to be even this much dependent upon these ice-vein bitches." He wasn't a very nice man to niece at this time. June 2nd, 1953, now it's a year later, and it's going to be the coronation. It took 14 months to plan the ceremony. What a long time getting this ceremony put together. Westminster Abbey was closed for almost a year to prepare for the coronation. They had an awful lot to do in the interior of the Abbey itself. They had to build a temporary annex, and that's down here. That's not there any longer. It was only built for there. Here's the Abbey, and that was the annex. Because the Abbey didn't have a lot of things. And so they had to add 52 water fountains for drinking water, and had to have extra lavatories, because the people are going to be there a long time for this ceremony. And they had 10 sick bays, just in case anybody got sick. And actually, a couple of people did get very ill. It was so hot in the Abbey itself that they really did have to be out. The annex also had all the regalia before it was going to be reused. There was a fitting room for all her clothes, and because she has to change clothes during the ceremony. And there was a kitchen, because they're going to serve lunch there. The date was set by meteorologists as when is going to be the best day to have it. And they decided that was going to be the certain date in June. And guess what? It rained. It was one of the coldest, rainiest days in all of June. It was just an absolutely horrible, horrible day. George had, she had attended her father's coronation, and he said to her afterwards, write down your impression. And it's because I did it in blue, it's hard for me to read. I thought it all very, very wonderful, but it got rather boring toward the end due to the multitude of prayers. Phil was made the chair of the committee to plan the coronation, and the total cost in today's terms was $41 million. Now, Philip insisted that the whole thing be done on TV. And what is unusual about that is that only 14% of the people of Britain had TVs at the time. And he insists it's going to be, he wants it to be modern. He wants them to be close to her. She disagrees with it. She says, well, what if during the coronation, during the crowning, people are doing things that aren't properly respectful at that time as they're watching? I was talking to somebody who was telling me that they had actually watched the coronation, and they were playing cards at the time. They had to stop playing cards because of that. So she was, she didn't really want this at all. And the Archbishop of Canterbury said that television, I love this, is potentially one of the greatest dangers of the world. So he objected to it. But Philip did prevail. They all did come up with the idea. And 27 million out of 36 million, 29 million did watch it. And a lot of people bought their first television sets in order to see it. On Monday, I was talking to somebody here afterwards, and she was saying that here, of course, she lived here in the United States, and she remembers going to a friend's house with her parents to watch the coronation. And she was saying, you know, was it live? No, it wasn't. It was live in Britain, Ireland, you know, locally. But what BBC did was they filmed it and immediately flew it around the world so that within 6 hours it was on American television. And so it appeared to be live. It was really an unbelievable achievement by BBC. Television did cause some problems, though. Her maids of honor were thought to look too pasty, and so they had to have special makeup put on. And the page boys, the marshal who's in charge of the actual affair, said that the boys looked scruffy and he made them all get haircuts. Because they don't have to do that way on television. They had rehearsals at Westminster Abbey, but she only attended the last two. She, in fact, practiced in Buckingham Palace. She had a lot of work to do, and so she really couldn't leave the palace. So she would walk the distances, and they had pinned a fake robe on her, and the robe she's going to have to wear is 36 pounds. Now, when you go back to your rooms, take a coat that you have, put it on the scales and see how much it weighs, and then probably multiply it about 3 or 4 times at least. Those are heavy, heavy robes that she's going to wear. Norman Hartnell was the big designer of the day, and he designed 8 different ones, and this is what she picked. He hates simplicity. He liked it to be very, very frolic, and that's what the coronation gown looked like. It was beautifully designed in that all of the emblems of the Commonwealth countries at the time, the Tudor rose of England, the Scottish thistle, and so on, were all embroidered. You can see them here. Here's the thistle for Scotland. Here's Ireland, Northern Ireland. It was just really a beautiful design that she had made. And then with 10 weeks to go before the coronation, now remember, they've worked almost 18 months at this time getting everything ready for her grandmother died. Queen Mary died. And Mary knew that she was not well, and so she had written in her last will and testament, the coronation had to go on. And so they had the funeral, and then the coronation. On the day of the coronation, the stewards who had wanted to check the abbey to make sure that everything was all right, they go early in the morning, they open up the abbey, and a cat was sitting on the coronation chair, sound asleep. And his name was, I love the cat's name, Matins, which of course is part of the church services. Matins, church services. That's what, and I looked all over trying to find a picture. Nobody took a picture of Matins, but he was asleep there. So the guests, there were 8,251 guests, and they started getting there at 6 a.m. in the morning. They had to get in these seats because at 9 o'clock the processions started in. And it was the very first one, the Lord Mayor of London and Speaker of the House of Commons, their procession came in first. There's an awful lot of processions going to go on here for the next 2 hours. Elizabeth went to the Abbey in what's called the Golden State Coach, and that is it. It was commissioned in 1780, and it weighs 4 tons. It's huge. Its interior is velvet and satin. It was the limousine of the day, but it's horribly uncomfortable. They didn't have springs at the time, and it really bounces along, so it's not very comfortable at all. I don't think she doesn't use it that often, if at all, since the coronation. That's all the people that takes to drive the horses. There are 8 horses, and then the yeoman of the guard and so on. It's hard for me to read in this angle. And the 8 Windsor Greys wore harness and morocco leather. And the names of the horses were Cunningham, Tovey, Noah, Tedder, Eisenhower, I thought that was neat, Snow White, Tipperary, and McCready. So those are the horses that brought her. Elizabeth arrives at the Abbey at 11 o'clock precisely, and she goes into the annex to get ready to go to the Abbey itself. She's going to enter the Abbey at 11:15 wearing the George IV state diadem, and that's it.
Wow.
That is, yeah, and that's one of 3 crowns she's going to wear that day. And now, as she's getting the crown on, getting ready to go into the Abbey, this is a hilarious moment. The doors of the Abbey opened. Everybody stood up expecting the Queen, and it was a group of people vacuuming the rug. that she's going to walk on. Because he had all those other processions.
Oh, my.
So they all laughed and they sat down again. But finally, at 11:15, she starts to walk down. Remember, that robe is 30-some pounds, and it was really heavy. And the carpet, even though it was just vacuumed, and the robes were hard to walk on. And so she said to the Archbishop of Canterbury, "Get me started, push me away, get me on the way." She processed down the Abbey to Psalm 122. It's been since 1626. This was the entrance psalm. And most of you would know this. I was glad when they said unto me, "Let us go into the house of the Lord."
Oh, yeah.
That's the song that they were singing at the time. There were 3 chairs used in the coronation ceremony. The first one was for the very early liturgical sections, and then the coronation chair itself, St. Edward's chair, and finally the throne. And this is the order of it. I'll go through this really quickly. The recognition, that's in the early part. She sits over here, and that's when the people say, yes, that she is the new queen. God, and they respond, "God save the queen." The oath is when she pledges to govern with mercy, and she is the head of the church. The anointing, and this is the really important one, this is the most solemn part of the ceremony. It's when the Holy Spirit supposedly comes down upon her, and now she goes from the chair she was in over to the coronation chair itself. And the Dean of Westminster, the Dean is the chief pastor of Westminster, pours a spoonful of holy oil from this, and it's a mixture of orange blossom, rose, cinnamon, jasmine mixed with musk and ambergris. And that's the holy oil. And then the Archbishop made a cross on her forehead, her hands, and her breast. This was so holy in Elizabeth's eyes that she said that they could not televise this. And so they brought this canopy over her, and they actually shut down the cameras at that time. They switched to something else for the few minutes of this time. The investiture was when she actually gets the crown and all the symbols of being queen. And that's the crown. It's called St. Amund's crown. It was made clear back with Charles II, and it's only worn during the coronation. She's never worn it again. It weighs 4 pounds and 12 ounces of solid gold. Now, again, when you get back to your room, find something that's about 4 pounds and put it on your head and see how uncomfortable that would be. It was so heavy that she sat at her desk in Buckingham Palace to practice wearing it. And she said, you have to be careful because when she's going to speak with this on it, she can't tip her head or it would. And so she had to teach herself to keep up with this crown on. I just found this recently, and actually saw this happen. They actually filmed this back in 1936. He was crowned 37. At her father's coronation, the Archbishop of Canterbury and the Dean of Westminster couldn't decide what was the front of the crown. And they stood and argued and kept moving it back and forth. And you actually can see this being done. And it's hysterical. One will hold it this way, then the other will take it, and they'll turn it around. So they never know if they got the crown right for her father. But they saw this for television. They didn't want all this foolishness on television. And so they actually put a little gold star there so that they knew where the front was. The enthronement, she now moves over to the throne. So now she's in the 3rd chair. And the homage. This is when all the lords of the land come to her and say they'll give her their honor. And the first one was, of course, her husband, Philip. And he says the pledge, "I, Philip, Duke of Edinburgh, do become your liege man of life and limb and of earthly worship. He then touched her crown and he kissed her. He was the only one, of course, that kissed her. After this, they privately took communion, and there's no pictures of that. And she changed out of the coronation crown to that crown. It's called the imperial state crown. She wears this one all the time. And a new purple robe of state. The imperial crown was for Victoria's coronation, and it has Elizabeth I's pearls, the Black Prince's ruby, and the second star of Africa in it. You can actually see them. Then after she had taken off that crown, put on the next one, and had the new state robes on, she went out of the atrium. Went to the annex where they had lunch. Now they'd been in there for hours, and so everybody was hungry. And the most famous dish that was served is still served today. And if you go online, you can get this recipe. It is coronation chicken. Have any of you heard of coronation chicken? It's really famous. They serve it all the time in Britain. And it's chicken in a curry sauce, and then there's a rice, green peas, and pimentos. Yeah. And so you can actually find this recipe online. The procession from Westminster Abbey now back to the palace was 2 miles long. There were 46 bands, 16,000 participants, and 30,000 members of the armed forces. So you can imagine, it was a long procession. It was really neat to see. And again, I actually have seen this procession. It is beautiful. To house all these 30,000 soldiers and Navy, people of the Navy and the airmen, they had to confiscate all the parks in London to put them, and they also opened up all of the air raid shelters from World War II. There just wasn't enough room for them all. And this, I think, is hysterical. They all had to, 2 days before the coronation, all the soldiers, airmen, had to refrain from intercourse and alcohol. Do you know why? No one knows. Intercourse or alcohol for 48 hours. Along the streets of London, there were stands for 96,000 individuals, and you had to have a ticket to sit in the stands. And then another 3 million stood. And most of them came the day before and had slept on the streets, waiting for the procession. It took an hour and 45 minutes to get to the palace. And as soon as she gets to the palace, she has to have her picture taken, the official one. Cecil Beaton, and you might remember Cecil Beaton. Do you remember Cecil Beaton?
No.
Oh, he was the set designer, costume designer for many motion pictures and Broadway plays. His most famous one was My Fair Lady. He won an Oscar for that beautiful black and white sequence of the ascot. So Cecil Beaton was a photographer, and he had a painting of Westminster Abbey taken, and so they posed her in front of that. And then she went out to greet the thousands of people that are there. Interestingly, Charles, who was then 4 years old, was at his mother's coronation. He was so bored. Look at the poor little kid. But he did have a special handwritten invitation. His sister, Anne, was too young. She was 3 years old. She stayed at Buckingham Palace, but she did come out with her parents on the balcony. The Duke of Windsor was not invited. It would be quite inappropriate for a king who had advocated to be present as an official guest at the coronation of one of his successors, Prime Minister Winston Churchill. Elizabeth didn't want him there, but she got Churchill to agree with her. And he said, "What a smug, stinking lot my relatives are." Now, the new royal family. Well, the royal family, John Osborne said, the royal family is gold filling in a mouth of decay. And it is a royal soap opera a sort of substitute or ersatz religion. Charles had been born in November 1948, and it took 4 doctors to supervise his birth. And Cecil Beaton took his picture just right after he was born. And he said, you know, Charles was sound asleep and they woke him up to get these pictures. And he'd done a good job. Because he was born before his mother was queen, he would not have the title His Royal Highness. His actual title was the Earl of Meredith. But her father, George VI, gave him the title His Royal Highness. So he has always been known as His Royal Highness Prince Charles. Anne then was born a few years later, August 1950, and they saluted that with 21 guns in Hyde Park. And she is called the Princess Royal. She was cute as a little girl. And there they are. Then they had a second family. Andrew. What do you know about Andrew right now?
Oh, dear.
Yeah, you laughed, you know.
Yeah.
Okay. And by the way, Andrew has always been his mother's favorite. And she is just furious with him over the scandal. He was born in the Belgian suite in Buckingham Palace, 1960. So notice the difference in ages. Anne was born in 50, so there's 10 years difference now between the family. And Edward, who was born in Buckingham Palace in 64. Elizabeth has opened Parliament every time except 2 years during her reign. Do you know why?
World War.
Nope, look at the war.
Pregnancies.
She was pregnant.
Pregnancies, right. The pregnancies. I'm going to borrow this chair. My knees are killing me.
Go right into it. My back would be killing me.
I have terrible arthritis in my knees. I'm going to second lean on this. And there they are. Both families. The trouble with Philip. The early reign, she did have trouble with her husband. January 53, she's now crowned queen by this time. Or excuse me, that's the year of her coronation. He was named Admiral of the Fleet, Field Marshal, and their Chief Marshal. Those covering all the armed services. But he was not made consort to the queen. And that was unusual because Victoria had named her husband, Albert, consort. A male, if there's a queen, the male is never crowned king. If there's a king, like her father George, then his wife is crowned queen. So this was a real, Philip was furious over this. And then there's a name crisis. What's his last name? Mountbatten. Right. So when George died, his uncle, Dickie Mountbatten, says, oh, the House of Mountbatten now reigns. But Elizabeth's last name is Windsor. Okay, so he wanted her to adopt the name Mountbatten, and she wouldn't have anything to do with it. She wanted to keep Windsor. And he says, I am nothing but a bloody amoeba. I'm the only man in the country not allowed to give his name to his own children. He was furious over this issue. But she established a new rule that anybody who is not a royal highness, a prince or a princess, or had the name HRH, his royal highness or royal highness, they would then use the name Mountbatten Windsor. Okay, you ready? Who today is the most famous Mountbatten Windsors? And you all know this, but we tend to forget. Ready?
Megan?
Okay.
Harry and
Yeah.
Meghan.
Archie Harrison, Mountbatten, Windsor, and Elizabeth Diana, Mountbatten, Windsor. Remember, Harry gave up his right to the throne,
Right.
and so they took the name Mountbatten, Windsor. Philip hated the media all the time. He threw nuts one time at him. He accidentally turned a hose on journalists. The guy was trying to take pictures. He said, "I hope that you'd break your neck." He really didn't like the media. And then he always was saying things that were getting him into problems. He called it Dontopediology. Whatever it is. Meaning putting one's foot in his mouth. And he was always doing this, especially in the younger years. Most famous one was when he was on U.S. Meet the Press. And he says, "We go into the red next year. Now, if nothing happens, we shall either have to, well, I don't know, we may have to move to smaller premises. Who knows?" Yeah, like they're going to leave Buckingham Palace. You know, that got him into a lot of trouble for saying that. Her early reign had its ups and downs. And up was this. 1957, she came to the United States to celebrate Virginia's 350th anniversary. And then the royal couple dined at the White House with the Eisenhowers. And the next two, I think, are funny. She and Phil went to their first American baseball game. And she visited a grocery store for the first time, and she wore a $43,000 mink coat. I suppose all of you, when you go to the grocery store, you always threw your mink off.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. But here she is looking at that. I love that one. Heart a down. Edward Grey, who was Lord Rotherham, said, and I can't read all of this, but what he says is, she doesn't speak well. She speaks like it's a little girl. And he really criticized her terribly. And there's the text. He was immediately attacked physically on the streets for this. He never apologized. He really did not get along with her at all. Thankfully, in her early years, Winston Churchill was the prime minister, and they had a marvelous relationship. He really helped her. Remember, she's really young. She was only 25. And so he was very helpful getting her over these rough spots. When he died, he was 90. And I remember this, I suppose a lot of you remember him dying. She did some things that were very unusual. She allowed the funeral to be at St. Paul's Cathedral, and she called him our greatest subject. And then she allowed his coffin and his family to leave the cathedral before she did. And that just is never, ever done. She had that much respect for him. The trouble with her uncle, the Duke of Windsor. The Queen had been careful not to see her uncle all these years. She was extremely careful with that. But he arrived in London in March 1965. He was going to have eye surgery. And so she did meet him. She did go to the hospital. And this is the first time she met with his wife, Wally Simpson, since they had left in 1936. Then they met again in 1968, and he asked permission that they could both be buried at Frogmore, and she did grant that. Not in the royal tombs, but he could be done at Frogmore. And then he requested that the yearly allowance of £10,000 would, after his death, would go to her. And the Queen thought a lot about this, and she decided she can £5,000. He didn't like her at all. 1972, the Duke of Windsor was very, very ill. He was near death. He was dying of throat cancer. And so she flew to France to see him, and he couldn't even get out of bed to greet her. And so she went in and talked to him privately. And from then on, the Duchess of Windsor stayed in France until her death. By now, in the late 1960s, there was a lot of people were criticizing the royal family. And so they came up with an idea to have a television show made of them, their everyday life. And she actually allowed this to go on. It took almost a year to film, and 37 million people watched it. They loved seeing this, and she hated it so much, she had it confiscated. It's never been seen since. Now, I read, and I really didn't check it out, I read that it's online, but she really never wanted it to be seen again. 23 years after that was what she called Anna Horribles. It's her, Dan Wakefield said, she has the ability to say a lot with very few words. It was the 40th anniversary, remember we're at the 70th now, of her ascension. She's at the Guildhall, and she says, this is not a year on which I shall look back with unadulterated pleasure. It was a horrible year, is what she said. Here's what had happened. The Duchess of York, Sarah Ferguson, and Texas millionaire Steve Wyatt were photographed together. It was not good. And in March, they announced that she and Andrew were separated. By the way, in all this problem with Andrew, Sarah has remained loyal to him in this last year. Princess Anne and Mark Phillips divorced. It was in April. In August, Fergie was photographed with John Bryan sucking her toes. And then in August, a tape reveals a secret call between Diana and James Gilbert. Now, there's trouble in that marriage. And then in November, her favorite palace, Windsor, had a major, major fire. It was a terrible year for her. 10 years after that, which was her Golden Jubilee, 3 days after they celebrated, Princess Margaret died. And 7 weeks later, her mother died. And she was over 100 at the time. And now the great anniversaries. The silver anniversary, the 50th anniversary of her wedding to Philip. I think that's a great picture. It's a really nice picture then. The 50th anniversary of her reign. The 60th anniversary of her reign. Do you remember, did any of you watch this when they went down the Thames River? It was a beautiful procession. The year that she broke Queen Victoria's reign. And now, this year's the Platinum Jubilee. She is the longest reigning monarch in Britain, but after her, anybody want to guess who the longest reigning was before her? Victoria. Right? She served 63 years. Now, I think the next one's funny. George III. He served 59 years. What do we all know about George III? You may know?
We separated from him.
Yes, he was the king during our revolution. He served a long time. And then it goes clear back to Henry III, back in 1272, and Edward III, back in 1377. So that was long. Okay, the longest reigning monarch in European history, however, is not Elizabeth. Anybody? Louis XIV.
Oh.
Yeah, he reigned 72 years. He was really young when he was a child when he took over. And then when Elizabeth dies, that's the key word for her death. The procedures are already set up. The Queen's private secretary will then call the Prime Minister and with the news of the death. He will then contact all the people of the Commonwealth nations that she has died. And those are the Commonwealth nations here. Both houses of Parliament will be called back into session. And at 10 a.m., Buckingham Palace will then announce that Charles is the king. Now, he is immediately king. Upon her death, he is immediately the king. The saying is always, the king is dead, long live the king. And in this case, it'll be the queen is dead, long live the king. So he will have been up, but at 10 o'clock, they will announce that he is the king. The coffin, wherever she is, will come back to Buckingham Palace. And King Charles will then go to Scotland and Northern Ireland to honor her. And on the 5th day, there'll be a procession from Buckingham Palace over to Westminster Abbey. And her day, she will lay in state there for 3 days. And then there will be a state funeral in Westminster Abbey, and she will be brought back to Windsor and be buried there. And that's where we leave off today. Okay, you want to turn the lights on, and then I'll take some questions and comments. Comments and questions? Yeah.
Was Edward VIII ever crowned? In other words, was
No.
coronation for him?
No, he was king because when his father died, he was king, but he was not crowned. When he abdicated, his father died in January, and he abdicated in December. So it was almost not quite a year that he was king. But they had already prepared. I'm sorry, I'm going to have to sit. You see me okay? Okay. So, back to your question. So, as soon as he became king, in January 36, they set in motion the coronation. They did the planning for the coronation. So when he abdicated, they decided they were so far along already with the plans for the coronation that they would just simply have the coronation of George on that date. So that's why he was crowned king quite quickly, more than normal, because they were just using the plans from Edward's. But no, he never was crowned. But he was the king. Anybody else? Comments or questions? Yeah.
Is her gown on display any place that she was
The
worn?
coronation gown?
Yes.
Yes, it is. It's not permanently on display. Okay. She doesn't live in Buckingham Palace in normal years. Forgetting COVID. Okay. She doesn't live in Buckingham Palace from August until late, almost Christmas time. She goes up to Balmoral, and they'd always up in Scotland. That's one of the family homes. And so when she is not there in August, they open up Buckingham Palace, and you can actually go and tour the Buckingham Palace. And that's when her gown is shown. So if you ever go to England, go in August so you can see her gowns there and some other state things. The crown jewels are not there. They are in the Tower of London. And you can go and see those. I did. I was in Britain. And so I did see the crown jewels. But they are not in Buckingham Palace. Anybody else a question or comment? Yeah.
Is there any record of what music was played for her procession?
Yes. I have to think. It was written, the procession that after they sang the song. As she processed out, they sang Zadok the priest. And Zadok was one of the priests during the reign of David, King David. in the Bible. Okay, he was one of the priests then. And that was written by Handel for one of the early coronations. And it's always been played ever since. You can actually hear that online. Zadok, Z-A-D-O-K. Zadok the priest. Yeah.
Thank you.
And there were original songs written for, there was a lot of music sung. Yeah. Anybody else? Yeah.
You mentioned at one point, kind of early on, that the House of Commons, that the members of the House of Commons got to go to something. Well, they have two sections of Parliament, the House of Lords and the House
Right.
of Commons. So what happened to the House of Lords?
Same would happen for them. Both houses, the House of Lords and House of Commons, are both called into session. So they do. The House of Commons, of course, makes law. The House of Lords approves it, although that's really been taken away almost by now. But yeah, they both are called. Anybody else?
The next one, after her, who comes?
I
Don't think you heard
can't.
this lady here.
Yeah, I know who it is. Could you ask her what
What's
she?
the question?
What? No.
Who comes after her?
Who follows this queen?
Oh, very good. Her son Charles. And right now, he is 73 years old. So Charles will be, and he has said that he will be King Charles. He will take that. He'll be Charles III. There's just no way that anybody's going to ever reign as long as Elizabeth does. Because Charles is 73, he could reign maybe 20 years. William, his son, is 40, so both of them would have to die off in order for George, the young boy, who's 7 now, to have any chance of reigning long, and that does seem impossible. Yeah.
Does anybody ever resign as queen? Has anybody ever quit?
Edward, her uncle, Edward VIII abdicated, king, he abdicated. There was a king clear back in the Middle Ages. I don't know how I'm going to phrase this. He had a sexual problem. Let me put it that way. And the lords, his retinue didn't like him because he's too open about it. And so they said, you can either abdicate or we'll kill you.
What a choice.
And he made the wrong choice. He said, I won't abdicate. So I probably shouldn't tell you this, but I will, because I always told my class this. They got a hot poker and stuck it up his rear end to burn out his insides.
Oh,
Yeah.
Oh, my God.
Now that'll be a picture you're going to have in your mind for a long time.
Way to go.
So he made the mistake of not abdicating. Yeah. And let me see, Charles I, during the Revolution of the British Revolution,